I was thinking about some of our past episodes, and every once in a while we touch on endangered or threatened species, or sometimes, unfortunately, even those who go extinct. And the question I have for you this week, Dustin, is has a bird species ever reappeared that you know of after having been declared extinct?
That definitely does happen from time to time with birds and other species, and we call this a Lazarus species because it seemingly has risen from the dead.
All right, so that's interesting, and that term is even interesting. Can you give us an example of a bird that has been a Lazarus species here in North America?
Sure, so keep in mind sometimes something gets declared extinct in the wild but still lives in captivity, and the whooping crane is a great example. By the 1940s, there were fewer than 20 birds left due to hunting and habitat loss. Most of these were in captivity, so it had been declared extinct in the wild. But by the 40s, that number was so small that when a population was rediscovered in the wild, thanks to extensive conservation efforts, like protecting their habitats and even using ultralight aircrafts to help reteach them their historic migration routes, their numbers have grown to over 800 individuals today.
That's so weird and interesting to me that they used aircrafts to teach these birds how to migrate again. So you used an example of the whooping crane in North America, but what about other birds that may have come back from being extinct? I had asked you to do some research on that. What did you find?
Yeah, there's a number of examples. Let's talk first about one called the Madagascar Pochard. This was a bird last seen in the wild in 1991 in a lake called Lake Alatra at Madagascar's largest wetland. But after multiple years of no sightings, it was declared extinct in the early 2000s. This one went extinct because it relied on freshwater wetlands, which had been severely degraded or destroyed due to agriculture, deforestation, and overgrazing by livestock. There simply wasn't enough habitat for them. In addition, some non-native fish species, such as tilapia, that were being raised or introduced into that lake, really decimated the aquaculture that was supporting them in that area. So these fish outcompeted with the pocards for food, disrupting their resources and the natural ecology. But in 2006, they were rediscovered in a more remote lake that they had previously not been known to exist in.
Oh, wow. It makes me kind of feel a little strange about the fact that I happen to really like tilapia, but okay.
Most tilapia are farm raised these days, so you can eat tilapia with a clear conscience for the most part.
All right, good. Good to know.
But ongoing conservation efforts, including captive breeding for the Madagascar pochard and habitat restoration, are helping them to recover.
Oh, that's good news.
Another one is the Bermuda Petrel. Now, the petrel is an interesting family of birds that a lot of people don't know about, but they're essentially ocean-going pelagic birds that spend most of their life flying around out over the ocean. So something sailors might be familiar with, but a lot of us landlubbers aren't in tune with. So although petrels live their life flying out over the ocean mostly, they absolutely have to get on land in order to reproduce. So that creates their most vulnerable time in their life cycle. And the Bermuda petrel was declared extinct in the 1620s after European colonization into the Caribbean islands because of a number of things that people had brought onto the island, specifically rats that came over on ships were eating the eggs and the young babies. Also, pigs that were brought in by settlers were sort of digging up and nosing through all the soil, which was disrupting that breeding habitat for the petrel. And cats, domestic house cats that were brought over, were good for keeping control of mice, but they also kept control of other things. The law of unintended consequences, so to speak. But then they were actually rediscovered in 1951 on one of the remote Bermuda Islands. So luckily, they hadn't suffered from the fate that we thought.
Wait a minute. So I want to think about the math here. So they were declared extinct in the 1620s, and then nobody thought these birds existed until 1951. That whole time they were like flying under the radar, pun intended, and people just thought they didn't exist anymore.
Yeah, so some of these petrel species might have looked like other petrels, and so maybe they were mistaken that way. And to be honest, unless you're an ornithologist, you probably wouldn't recognize that specific species. You might just think it's a bird or a seagull or whatever.
Still, I mean, that time frame, talk about rising from the dead, right?
Right. And because they're a bird that flies over the ocean all the time, right? They're spending all their time out at sea, so they're not really abundantly present around people. So that certainly contributed to that math.
Interesting. All right, so they find them in 1951. I would imagine that would have been big news within the scientific community. And then what? Like, have they been supporting these birds since
Yeah, that's
then?
when the conservation efforts started. So they had captive breeding programs in order to bring them back, habitat restoration efforts in order to give them a place to live, and then community engagement to help reduce further future human impact. You know, keep your cats indoors or actively remove threats like cats and rats from those islands if they were discovered there again.
So there's two species. Do you have any other
Sure.
examples?
There's another petrel called the New Zealand storm petrel. This one had been last recorded in the 1800s, and having had no confirmed sightings of that bird for over 150 years, it was presumed extinct. And the reasons for its decline were very similar also rats and cats, but also stoats and weasels in that ecology were, you know, eating the eggs and eating the young babies when they did have to be on land to reproduce. And then finally, deforestation and land development of coastal areas, right? People like to build a house or a hotel on a coastline, but there are real ecological impacts to doing that. So luckily, we've gotten more in tune with that in, you know, modern times.
Okay. So we went 150 years thinking that these birds didn't exist anymore. So they, what year were they rediscovered?
I believe it was 2003 or so. They were found and identified to be present again. And that was a shock to the scientific community because New Zealand and Australia in particular are sort of well in tune with, they're heavily studied because there's a lot of endemic birds to those islands because they're so remote and isolated from the rest of the world. So in order to have found something new, it was you know, well documented.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I would imagine they're doing conservation efforts with those birds as well?
They are same kind of thing, right? They're working to identify and protect the nesting areas that they have. There's active ornithological research sites in those places. Controlling invasive predators is key to keeping that habitat safe. And then finally, monitoring populations to better understand their life cycle and other threats that they're encountering and keep track of their numbers to make sure they're always heading in the right direction.
Thinking about all this, I guess my question for you is why do you think scientists sometimes like get it wrong? No offense to scientists. I'm part of the scientific community myself, but why do you think sometimes a species is declared extinct when it's not?
Well, this is a huge challenge because there's a lot more species out there than there are people that are researching species dynamics and stuff like that. So it's impossible to keep close track on every single species. And then, of course, the scarcer they get, the harder it is. So it's sort of like a hockey stick graph where, you know, the further down the road you get, the more difficult it gets until, you know, they ultimately aren't able to find any proof that something is still alive. Many of these animals live in extremely remote locations or really hard to access locations. So it gets financially and time difficult to be able to find these species. And sometimes there's actually a disappearance from the fossil record. So, for example, there was an ancient fish called the coelacanth that had been discovered in fossils 66 million years old and older, but disappeared from the fossil record after the 66 million year ago mark. But in the late 1930s, a coelacanth was caught by a fisherman off the southern coast of Africa, and it was determined it hadn't actually been extinct. And no one really knows why there are no fossils between 66 million years ago and current times, but that's actually what happened. So yeah, that was a unique story. And then sometimes it's just that sightings are so few and far between, or they're mistaken for other species. And not all regions have the funding or the expertise in order to be able to track down all of these different species and you know, keep tabs on them. But with new tools like game cameras and GPS tracking and DNA research, it's allowed us to better focus our efforts to be able to see and research where something is and know that that research is occurring in the proper area for habitat and stuff like that.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. You know, what I love about this particular question of the week is it's a really hopeful topic. I feel like sometimes with some of our content on our various channels, we're talking about the need for conservation because we're watching the decline of species. But to be talking about the surprises of finding out that some of them really are still here is really cool.
And to know that the work people are doing is actually having a positive impact, and you can both see that impact and measure its progress over time is very encouraging.
So I want to build on what you just said. So we have a lot of nature lovers that watch our videos and interact with us on our various channels who talk about not only their enthusiasm for nature and wildlife, but the active hobbies and activities that they do to engage with nature and wildlife. So for those who are watching this video, what can they do to kind of help conservation efforts like this so that hopefully we rediscover more good news about the animals that are around us every day?
Yeah, it's about contributing, and you can contribute with your time, talent, and resources. So sometimes some people who are able to get out there and contribute to citizen science, like eBird and iNaturalist, and different counting and observing reporting activities that are out there in the sort of crowdsourcing space. But then there's also the paying attention and being aware of what's going on in the conservation world so that you can tailor your behavior to that thing. Obviously, in the modern era, there's different choices we have about an internal combustion car or an electric car or using your bicycle that all can have impacts. And about where you spend your tourism dollars, whether it's an ecotourism or if you want to fly someplace or not, they can have impacts. All that can make a huge difference. And of course, being aware and being intentional about where you send your sort of charity funds too, right? I like to pick one or two charities every year, or causes, not necessarily charities, but causes every year, and funnel our money that way too. So
I would also say that there are free things that people can do, even if you don't have access to wild places where you could be capturing citizen science data, or even if you don't have a lot of funds for charity work. And one of those is sharing information. Most of us have social media nowadays. So when you come across content like ours, which I would love for you to share with your channels, but also Audubon, any of the conservation groups, even when you're just scrolling through your feed and you see a conservation news story through the Associated Press or other sources, share that amongst your friends, and your networks. Because I do feel that that information sharing is a really important part as well. And it costs us nothing to do that work.
Yeah, the Nature Conservancy is a really good one too to be in tune with, whether you contribute to them financially or just stay in tune with the ecology news of the day through that organization is really good.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so to those of you who are watching this, I'm curious to know, were you surprised by any of these rediscoveries? I personally was surprised by some of the timelines and how long those timelines were of us thinking things were extinct and rediscovering them. I'm also curious for birders who are watching this video. Have any of you spotted a rare bird? What was your experience in those situations? Those are really exciting stories, and we'd love to read about them in the comments and talk to you guys about that for sure.
Yeah, and this week, I almost forgot, we almost had a true Lazarus species. So the Tasmanian tiger was a species of marsupial in the island of Tasmania that had the last known individual went extinct from the Cincinnati Zoo in like 1936. And there's a group in Australia called the proper name for the Tasmanian tiger is the thylacine. So there's a group called the Thylacine Awareness Group of Australia, and they believed that they had seen 3 Tasmanian tigers, a mother, a father, and a cub, got video evidence of it, and were prepared to do a press release this week and announced that it was coming while they were waiting for the experts to take a good look at their video. Unfortunately, the experts came back and said it wasn't actually a Tasmanian tiger, that they were Tasmanian panda melons, which is sort of a wallaby-like marsupial. So it was close, but no cigar. But the thylacine also might be one of the first species that gets recreated from DNA evidence. So there's work in that area happening too.
Okay, then. All right. Well, if any of you watching have any questions that you would like us to address in our Question of the Week series, this is a reminder from me to you to drop your questions in the comments. So that's all for today's episode. But before we head off on our next adventures, this is just a quick reminder to you, our viewer, that you can find Dustin's wildlife photography and links to all of our content channels on our website, hikeandhearth.com.
And we love being part of the YouTube nature lovers community. So keep sharing your comments on your experiences with nature, wildlife, and conservation. And if you're not already a subscriber, please be sure to join us.
Okay, Dustin, are you ready to send us off for today?
I sure am. Until next time, friends, keep your eyes on the skies and your hearts in the wild.